Elvis Presley was sitting in his childhood home in Memphis, staring at his mother's bedroom when the phone rang. It was August 16th, 1958, 2 days after Gladys Presley's funeral. Elvis hadn't left the house since they'd buried her, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, just sat in the living room, surrounded by her things, and tried to understand how the world could keep existing when his mother didn't. When the phone rang, Elvis's father Vernon answered it, talked for a minute, then covered the receiver and looked at Elvis. "It's Ed Sullivan. He wants you to come to New York, do the show." Elvis looked at his father like he'd spoken a foreign language. "What?" Vernon's face was uncomfortable. "He says it would be good for you. Get your mind off things. And the money's good. Really good." Elvis felt something cold settle in his stomach. His mother had been dead for 48 hours, and Ed Sullivan wanted him to perform. To understand what this meant to Elvis, you have to understand who Gladys Presley was to him. She wasn't just his mother, she was everything. His first fan, his protector, his best friend. Elvis had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi. His twin brother Jesse had been stillborn. And from that moment, Gladys had poured all her love, all her fear, all her desperate hope into Elvis. She'd held him too close, worried too much, never let him out of her sight. And Elvis had loved her for it, had never wanted to be away from her, even when he became famous, even when he was making more money than they'd ever dreamed of. Elvis called his mother every single day, bought her a house, gave her everything she wanted because she was his world. And then, in August 1958, Gladys got sick. Her liver was failing. Years of worry and stress and drinking had destroyed it. Elvis brought her to the hospital, sat by her bed, held her hand, told her she was going to be okay. But on August 14, at 3:15 a.m., Gladys Presley died. Elvis was there, watched her take her last breath, and something inside him shattered completely. At the funeral, Elvis had to be held up by 2 men because his legs wouldn't support him. He cried so hard he couldn't breathe, and when they lowered her casket, Elvis threw himself on it, screaming, "Mama, Mama, don't leave me." They had to pull him away, had to force him to let her go. Now, 2 days later, Ed Sullivan was on the phone, offering him money to perform. Elvis wanted to say no, wanted to scream that his mother had just died, and he couldn't sing, couldn't perform, couldn't be Elvis Presley, when he felt like he was dying too. But his father was looking at him with those hopeful eyes, and Elvis knew they needed the money, knew the hospital bills were piling up, knew his mother would have wanted him to work, so he heard himself say, "Okay." When Vernon looked relieved, told Ed, then hung up and said, "Sunday. They want you Sunday." That was 5 days away, 5 days to pull himself together, to become Elvis again. Elvis flew to New York on Saturday. The whole flight, he stared out the window and thought about his mother, about how she'd been so proud when Ed Sullivan finally booked him, about how she'd watched every appearance, about how she'd called him after each show and told him he was wonderful, and now she was gone, and he was going to perform on the same show she'd loved watching, without her there to see it. The irony felt cruel, like God was punishing him, making him dance on his mother's grave. When Elvis arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theater, the staff treated him like everything was normal. "Great to have you back, Elvis. Can't wait to hear what you're singing." Nobody mentioned his mother. Nobody acknowledged that anything had changed. And Elvis, who had spent the past week crying, suddenly had to put on the performance, had to smile and be charming, and be the Elvis everyone expected. He went to his dressing room, looked at himself in the mirror. He looked terrible, eyes swollen, face gaunt. He'd lost weight, but the costume department had brought him his usual outfit, the one that made him look like Elvis Presley. Rock and roll star, not Elvis Presley. grieving. Ed Sullivan came to the dressing room before the show. Elvis was sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. Ed knocked. Came in without waiting. "Elvis, good to see you." Elvis looked up. Ed's face showed nothing. No sympathy, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just, "We're thinking Hound Dog, and maybe one of the gospel songs. That work for you?" Elvis's voice was flat. "Sure." Ed nodded, started to leave, then paused. "Elvis, I know this is hard, but the show must go on. You understand that, right?" Elvis understood that Ed didn't care that his mother had died, didn't care that Elvis was barely holding himself together, only cared about ratings, about getting Elvis on stage while the publicity was hot. "I understand," Elvis said quietly. The show started. Elvis waited backstage, could hear the audience applauding, could hear Ed doing his introduction, and then Ed was saying his name. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." Elvis walked out. The audience went wild, screaming, cheering, so loud it hurt his ears. He stood at the microphone. The band started playing, and Elvis opened his mouth and sang, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog." The words came automatically. He'd sung this song thousands of times, but tonight it felt hollow, meaningless. His mother was dead, and he was singing about a dog. The absurdity of it made him want to laugh or cry. He wasn't sure which. He finished the song. The audience applauded. Ed came over, put his arm around Elvis's shoulder for the cameras. "Wasn't he wonderful, folks?" More applause. Ed was smiling. Elvis was smiling too. The camera couldn't see that his hands were shaking, that his smile was about to crack. Ed said something about Elvis's next song, a gospel number. Elvis's mother's favorite. Elvis hadn't known they'd planned that, hadn't agreed to it, but the band was already starting, and Elvis had to sing. The song was "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the song they'd sung at his mother's funeral. And as Elvis started singing, as the words came out, something inside him broke. His voice cracked on the second verse. Tears started falling. He couldn't stop them, couldn't hold them back anymore. The audience went quiet. This wasn't the hip-swiveling, dangerous Elvis. This was a boy crying for his mother on national television. Ed, standing in the wings, saw it happening, saw Elvis falling apart, and for the first time, something in Ed's face changed. Not quite sympathy, but recognition that maybe he'd made a mistake. Elvis finished the song somehow, walked off stage, made it to his dressing room before he collapsed, fell to his knees, sobbed so hard he couldn't breathe. His manager found him there, tried to help him up, but Elvis couldn't stand, couldn't stop crying. And then Ed Sullivan was in the doorway. Ed dismissed the manager, closed the door, and for a long moment, just stood there, looking at Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, broken on the floor. "I lost my mother too," Ed said finally. Elvis looked up. Ed's face was softer than Elvis had ever seen it. 20 years ago, cancer, and they made me do the show that week too, told me it would help. That work was the best medicine. Ed sat down in a chair. "It wasn't. It was torture. Smiling when I wanted to scream, performing when I wanted to disappear. And I've never forgiven them for making me do it." He looked at Elvis. "And now I did the same thing to you." Elvis wiped his face. "Then why did you call me?" Ed was quiet for a long time. "Because that's what this business does. It takes everything from you, your time, your privacy, your grief, and it tells you that's the price of fame, that if you want to stay on top, you have to give up being human." He paused. "I'm sorry, Elvis. I shouldn't have called you. You should be home, with your family, not here performing for people who don't understand what you've lost." Elvis didn't know what to say. Ed Sullivan, the man who had fought against rock and roll, who had represented everything establishment and conservative, was apologizing, was admitting he'd been wrong. It didn't fix anything, didn't bring his mother back, but it meant something. "What do I do now?" Elvis asked. Ed stood up. "You go home. You grieve. You take as long as you need. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you come back, but not before." He opened the door. "I'll handle the press. Tell them you weren't feeling well. They don't need to know the truth." Elvis flew back to Memphis that night. Didn't do the second half of the show. Didn't apologize. Just left. And Ed Sullivan, true to his word, told reporters that Elvis had been under the weather, that he'd been a trooper to perform at all. The press ate it up, called Elvis dedicated, professional. They had no idea he'd been falling apart, no idea that Ed Sullivan had found him on the floor and finally understood the cost of what he'd asked. Elvis Presley never fully recovered from his mother's death. People close to him said he was different after, sadder, more isolated. He'd call out for her in his sleep, would buy her grave, fresh flowers every week, and when his friends would try to get him to move on, to accept that she was gone, Elvis would say, "You don't understand. She was the only person who loved me before I was Elvis Presley. Everyone else loves what I became. She loved who I was." Ed Sullivan and Elvis Presley had a complicated relationship after that night. Elvis appeared on Ed's show several more times, and each time, Ed treated him differently, with more respect, more care, less like a commodity, and more like a human being. And years later, when Ed Sullivan was asked about Elvis, he'd say, "I made a lot of mistakes in my career, but calling Elvis 2 days after his mother's funeral was the worst. I learned something that night though. That fame doesn't make grief easier. If anything, it makes it harder, because you have to grieve in front of everyone, and they expect you to do it gracefully." When Elvis Presley died in 1977, Ed Sullivan was one of the first to call Graceland, to offer condolences, and when asked if he'd say something publicly about Elvis, Ed declined, said his relationship with Elvis was private, that some things didn't belong on television. It was perhaps the kindest thing Ed Sullivan ever did for Elvis. Let him be remembered without commentary, without spectacle, just let him rest. The way Ed should have let him rest in 1958 when his mother died, and he needed time to grieve instead of time to perform. That night in August 1958, when Elvis Presley sang while his heart was breaking, and Ed Sullivan finally understood what he'd done, something changed, not just in their relationship, but in what Ed understood about fame, about power, about the responsibility that comes with being the person who books the talent, who decides, who performs and when, who profits from other people's pain. Ed Sullivan spent the rest of his career trying to be better, trying to remember that the people on his stage weren't just acts. They were human beings, with real lives and real grief, and real limits. He didn't always succeed, but he tried. And maybe that's all anyone can do. Try to be better after you realize you've been wrong. What would you have done in Ed's position? If this story moved you, consider subscribing. These moments deserve to be remembered.